On the Olympic podium, amid the slow playing of the United States national anthem and the stars and stripes being slowly raised high, Carl Lewis stood tall with the gleaming gold medal on his chest, an image that has been etched deep into the memory of an entire generation. He was not just the fastest or the longest jumper, he was the symbol of absolute dominance in modern track and field. 9 Olympic gold medals spanning 4 games. Consecutive victories that seemed endless, records that left opponents despairing before they even stepped onto the track. From Los Angeles 1984 to Atlanta 1996, Carl Lewis did not merely represent himself. He represented an America seeking the perfect image of strength, discipline, and sportsmanship. The press called him a living legend, the standard of greatness, the answer to the question of what an ideal athlete looks like. In the eyes of the public, Carl Lewis was the tireless winner, the one who always stood above the rest, the man whom history seemed to have destined to be born to win. Every stride, every takeoff of his was recounted as classic moments, analyzed, celebrated, and repeated until that image became immutable. Carl Lewis, unbeatable, perfect, flawless. But within that very perfection, another truth began to form, quietly and painfully, because to maintain that image, he had to pay a price that very few people saw. Behind the applause and the blazing lights was a human being forced to control even the smallest emotion, not allowed to doubt, not allowed to be weak, not even allowed to feel relief after a victory. Carl Lewis lived in constant fear that just one slowdown, one failure, and everything would collapse. Not just his career, but the person he had built over many years. Therefore, while the world saw only an invincible legend, he quietly lived another life, closed off and lonely, where there was no cheering, no recognition, only brutal discipline and the will to survive. For 30 years straight, he had to split himself in two. One, Carl Lewis for the public, always strong, always victorious, and the remaining Carl Lewis bearing the pressure, the pain, and the emptiness that no one was allowed to know about. He did not live 2 lives because he wanted to be different, but because that was the only way to keep standing in a world that did not permit him to be an ordinary human being. If you want to continue exploring the untold dark sides behind the glory of American sports and cultural legends, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support us. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned as we move on to the next part, where the story of Carl Lewis's double life begins to be revealed. After the moment of glory that the world believes to be the pinnacle of happiness, Carl Lewis's story is forced to turn back very far, to a place with no cheering, no medals, no lights, but which is the starting point of everything he would carry with him throughout his life. A childhood with no right to weakness. Carl was born into a family where sports were not a choice, but the natural order. Both his parents were deeply involved in track and field, understanding every stride, every takeoff, every tiny margin that could decide between victory and defeat. In that home, no one shouted or scolded loudly. There was no violence, no visible wounds, but there existed a pressure far more subtle and persistent. The cold expectation that this child must excel, must improve, must be worthy of the foundation into which he was born. Carl grew up amid regular training sessions, corrections that were precise to the point of cruelty, and evaluating gazes that always came before any praise. While other children learned to dream, to fall, and cry out for comfort, Carl learned to stay silent, to stand straight, to swallow his emotions inward so as not to interrupt the rhythm of expectation. He was not forbidden to cry, but he understood very early that tears brought no value in an environment where results always mattered more than feelings. No one told Carl that he was not allowed to be weak, but everything around him silently taught him that weakness was a luxury not meant for him. Those afternoons on the training field, those mornings waking up to a preset schedule, gradually shaped a child who could control himself to a frightening degree a child who learned to suppress before he even had time to understand what he truly wanted. Carl's childhood had no clear scars to recount, no tragic events for outsiders to pity, but that very absence was the most silent tragedy. He was not allowed to slow down to discover himself. There was no space to ask, "What if?" because every path seemed to have been drawn in advance. When Carl won his first races, no one celebrated for long, because victory was seen as obvious, and the obvious did not require emotion. In that calm, a chilling message was etched deep. Only when you win are you acknowledged. Only when you move forward do you have value. Carl learned to smile at the right moments, to keep a calm face when tired, and to hide his fear of failure even from himself. He had no memories of being allowed to relax, to make mistakes, to be an ordinary child. Instead, his childhood was filled with invisible responsibility, with the feeling that if he did not keep moving forward, he would disappoint everyone around him. That was the foundational sorrow of Carl Lewis, not material deprivation, not physical harm, but being stripped of the right to be weak from a very young age. A child who grew up too soon, carrying on his shoulders the image that adults had placed there, learning to become correct before he could learn to become himself. And from that very foundation, a person forged to win was formed. But at the same time, a life began in which innocence, freedom, and relief would forever be things he could only see from afar, like a dream that was never his own. The teenage years of Carl Lewis passed faster than any race he would ever run later, because while other kids were still fumbling to figure out what they were good at, Carl had already won too much, too early, and too convincingly to ever turn back. His talent revealed itself not in an explosive way, but like a cold certainty, every stride neat, every takeoff precise, every result making coaches and adults around him nod as if everything had already been decided. At first, victory brought a sense of safety, because it meant acceptance, the silent nod that he was on the exact path laid out for him. But very quickly, Carl realized a terrifying truth. Victory did not free him. It bound him even tighter to his own ability. When you win once, people praise your potential. When you win continuously, people start expecting it. And when you win too much, people no longer accept anything less than victory. Each first-place finish was no longer joy, but a chilling reminder that next time he was not allowed to do worse, that every eye would follow every stride, every smallest movement, just to see if that miracle might crack. The fear of failure did not come after a fall, but right in the moment of victory, when Carl stood at the peak of a competition and wondered, not, "I've done it," but what about next time? He was not allowed to get bored, because boredom was seen as a sign of weakness. Not allowed to get tired, because fatigue meant not enough discipline. And certainly not allowed to doubt, because doubt could shake the entire image that others had placed on his shoulders. Carl learned to hide the moments he wanted to stop, the mornings he woke up with a heavy body and an empty mind, because in his world there was no room for hesitation. Each time he ran faster, jumped farther, the circle of expectation tightened a little more, until talent, which should have been a gift, turned into an invisible prison with no exit. It was during this period that the public Carl Lewis began to form, not as a deliberate strategy, but as a survival mechanism. It was an image always confident, always in control, always knowing what he was doing, a shell built from perfection, and repeated over and over until even he himself found it hard to distinguish where the real person ended and the icon that everyone needed to see began. Carl understood that just one small crack, just one moment he appeared tired or confused, and the entire system of expectation would crash down on him with ruthless disappointment. So he chose silence, chose to keep moving forward, chose to let his talent lead him even farther, even as his heart began to grow weary from holding itself together for too long. Those around him saw a genius growing, a young athlete seemingly born to win, but no one saw the deepening loneliness in his eyes, the growing gap between the person inside and the image outside. Carl Lewis, at a very young age, was already trapped in his own ability, forced to become what everyone believed he had to be, rather than what he might have wanted to become. And from that moment on, talent was no longer a door to freedom, but a wall that grew higher with every victory, locking him into a life where every step forward was cheered, but every step back, no matter how small, was something that was not allowed to exist. In the summer of 1984, when Carl Lewis stepped into the Los Angeles Olympics, he carried not only the body of an athlete at the peak of his form, but also the heavy expectations of an entire nation craving a new icon. America at that time needed a story to believe in, an image to be proud of, a hero pure enough, strong enough, and perfect enough to represent everything they wanted to see in themselves after years filled with doubt and unrest. And Carl Lewis, with his speed, his explosiveness, his discipline, and his standard-setting coolness, appeared right on time like a prearranged answer. 4 gold medals were not just an athletic feat. They were a symbolic affirmation, a declaration that America could still produce people who rose above everyone else, not only faster and stronger, but also righter. Carl Lewis was compared to Jesse Owens, elevated by the media as the embodiment of pure Olympic spirit, of flawless sportsmanship, of a winner everyone could trust. But that very legendary moment, when the whole world looked at him with absolute admiration, was also the moment an invisible burden was placed on his shoulders without anyone asking if he was ready. From then on, Carl Lewis was no longer seen as an athlete competing, but as a living standard, a moral measuring stick, an image that was not allowed to deviate. 4 gold medals did not open the door to freedom. They slammed shut the door back to normality, because America did not need a Carl Lewis who got tired, who doubted, or who made mistakes. They needed a Carl Lewis who always won, always right, always stood above everyone else. From that point, no mistake was forgiven, not only on the track, but in every word, every gesture, every smallest expression. A defeat was no longer a sporting result. It was a betrayal of the image the public had built. A moment of weakness was no longer something a human could experience. It became a sign of collapse. Carl Lewis understood this very well, and that very understanding forced him to close himself off even more, to control himself even tighter, to live cautiously as if just one step off, the perfect path would be enough for everyone to turn away. The legend was created at breakneck speed, but the price was the human being inside locked tightly behind that invulnerable shell. He was no longer allowed to fail in order to learn, no longer allowed to err in order to grow, because in that position, he no longer represented just himself. Every race after the 1984 Olympics was no longer a fair competition, but a silent trial where Carl Lewis always entered as the defendant of his own overly great success. If he won, it was obvious. If he lost, it was a shock that needed explaining, dissecting, and judging. The greatness he achieved in that brilliant summer became chains that dragged on for many years afterward, forcing him to live up to the image America had chosen for him, rather than the image he could freely adjust to the natural changes of a human being growing up and aging. Behind the 4 gold medals was a bitter reality. From that moment, Carl Lewis no longer had the right to be an athlete learning to accept limits, but became an icon frozen in his most perfect moment. The real man, with his very human fears, fatigue, and doubts, was pushed backstage, while the legendary Carl Lewis was placed on stage protected, worshipped, but guarded just as strictly as a national treasure. And right there at the 1984 Olympics, where the whole world thought Carl Lewis had touched the absolute freedom of glory, he unwittingly stepped into a gilded cage where every step had to be careful, every emotion had to be hidden, and every mistake, no matter how small, was no longer in the category of things allowed to exist. After the 1984 Olympics, when the stage lights had not yet dimmed and America was still drunk on the thrill of glory, Carl Lewis began to enter the most dangerous phase of his life, the phase where living authentically became a risk. In front of the public, he was expected to be the embodiment of unshakable confidence, of pride that needed no explanation, of a man seemingly born to win and never doubt himself. He appeared with a steady gait, decisive speech, cool and focused eyes, as if everything was under absolute control. The media needed a Carl Lewis like that, an icon strong enough to stand firm in an era full of skepticism toward elite sports, and he understood that if he revealed even a tiny crack, that image would immediately be torn apart. But when the locker room door closed, when there were no longer camera lenses, no cheering, and no praise, the real-life Carl Lewis was a completely different person. Silent, closed off, and lonely to a frightening degree. He was not the type to seek out crowds for release, nor did he know how to unload pressure through close relationships. Instead, he chose silence as armor, because only in silence was he not forced to explain who he was beyond the image the world had imposed. The gap between those two selves grew larger with each year of competition, each new victory, each time he had to step into the light with a calm face and straight shoulders, while inside was a weary body and a mind stretched tight like a wire. Carl Lewis realized that if he allowed these two worlds to touch, if he let too much of his real self show, not only would the icon be threatened, but his very ability to remain at the top would be questioned. So he began to isolate himself not because he disliked people, but because that was the only way to survive in an environment that did not accept contradiction. He kept distance from colleagues, stayed away from relationships that might expose his fragility, and built around himself a safe space that no one could enter without permission. Many people saw that coldness and called it arrogance, conceit, being unapproachable, but very few understood that it was not a personality choice. It was the reflex of a man who had lived too long under the microscope of expectation. The double life of Carl Lewis was not deception meant to fool the world. It was a sophisticated defense mechanism to protect what remained of himself from being crushed by the very greatness he represented. Each day that passed, he had to balance maintaining the invincible image for the public and keeping himself from collapsing in silence. He was not allowed to appear bored, because boredom would be interpreted as a sign of weakness, not allowed to be tired, because fatigue would be seen as a lack of discipline, and certainly not allowed to doubt, because doubt could shake the faith an entire nation had placed in him. That is why living authentically with all the very human emotions like fear, conflict, or emptiness became dangerous, a luxury he dared not touch. Carl Lewis knew that if he revealed his true self at the wrong moment, everyone would turn away, not because they were cruel, but because they needed the legend more than they needed the truth. And so he accepted living two parallel lives, one public life, carefully polished and strictly guarded, and one private life, quiet, where he carried everything not allowed to appear in the light. That self-isolation gradually became habit, then instinct, until even he himself found it hard to recognize where the real person ended and the role he had rehearsed for years began. But deep down, Carl Lewis knew very well that this double life did not bring happiness. It only brought survival. He did not live two lives to avoid responsibility, but to keep himself intact enough to keep stepping onto the track, keep winning, keep meeting what the world demanded. That was the central tragedy of his life, having to sacrifice the emotional wholeness of a human being to protect the perfect image of a legend. And the further along it went, as his career lasted longer than anyone expected, the cost of living those two lives became clearer, not through loud collapses, but through a slow-burning, persistent weariness that no medal was heavy enough to compensate for. As Carl Lewis delved deeper into the peak of his career, the world of track and field around him also gradually changed in a dark way that no one could deny. The late 1980s and early 1990s were no longer the pure era of Olympic ideals, but had become an underground battlefield where performances were bought with chemicals, where records were eroded by cheating, and where public trust crumbled little by little. In that context, Carl Lewis stood in a particularly dangerous position. He was not just an athlete, but the moral symbol that America had built with its own hands. When other names fell, were exposed, stripped of medals, and dragged from the podium, the suspicious eyes did not leave Carl Lewis. In fact, they turned toward him with even harsher intensity, because if a legend like him fell too, it would mean there was no one left to believe in. Carl understood very well that in that era, no one was truly innocent in the eyes of the public, and not being convicted did not mean being fully trusted. Every time he stepped onto the track, it was not just a race against time or opponents, but a confrontation with the invisible skepticism shadowing his every stride. He was scrutinized more closely than anyone else. Every test sample, every number, every small change in his body could be interpreted in the most unfavorable way. The standard of absolute perfection placed on him was suffocatingly heavy. Not only did he have to win, but he had to win in a way that left no questions. Not only did he have to be clean, but he had to appear truly clean in a world already accustomed to not believing anyone. In that environment, a single small mistake was enough to erase an entire lifetime he had built. No clear evidence needed. Just one unresolved suspicion was sufficient for public opinion to turn away. Carl Lewis lived with that silent fear for many years, a fear he was not allowed to name, because if he spoke up too much, people would ask why he needed to defend himself, and if he stayed silent, that silence would be seen as a sign of hiding something. That was the cruel paradox of the doping era. Those who tried to stay clean bore the heaviest mental burden, because they had no right to err, no right to be ambiguous, and no right to be misunderstood and then corrected. Carl was not allowed to explain his feelings of anxiety, not allowed to talk about the fear that just one abnormal test result, even accidental, could destroy a lifetime of honor. He was not allowed to admit that he was living under stress, because a moral icon was not permitted to appear uneasy. So he chose to endure in silence, to keep training, to keep competing, to keep winning, as if what was happening around him did not exist at all. But each victory in that era carried an unusual bitterness. It was not just an affirmation of talent, but also an escape, one lucky time not being swept into the vortex of suspicion. Carl Lewis could not fully enjoy the joy of surpassing opponents, because deep down he always knew that tomorrow those suspicious eyes would still be there, waiting for any slip. Surviving in the doping era did not require recklessness from him, but demanded a level of discipline and self-control that was inhumanly harsh. He had to control everything that entered his body, every habit, every tiniest detail, because not only his career, but the honor of a national icon hung precariously on every personal decision. In that context, Carl Lewis's double life gained yet another layer. Not just the separation between the public self and the private self, but also the separation between the inner fear and the calm he was forced to display outwardly. He lived with the feeling that at any moment, everything could collapse without warning. And the most terrifying thing was not the collapse itself, but that he would never have the chance to explain who he was and what he had tried to preserve. Carl Lewis existed in the doping era not by defeating it, but by not letting it swallow him whole, by accepting a prolonged life of tension where cleanliness did not bring peace of mind, but only the responsibility to keep proving, over and over again, that he was worthy of the fragile trust the world still held for him. Surviving the doping era did not bring Carl Lewis a sense of safety or release. It only pushed him into another state, quieter and more prolonged. loneliness at the top. The brighter the spotlight grew, the farther the distance between him and the world around him became, not because he wanted to stand above others, but because, in that position, no one truly stood beside him. Carl Lewis did not have close friends in the ordinary sense, no one to call at the end of the day and say that today he was tired, today he doubted himself, today he was afraid. The relationships in the sports world around him were mostly built on competition, caution, and the necessary distance to protect oneself. Colleagues looked at him with respect mixed with wariness, because standing next to Carl Lewis meant always being compared, always placed in the shadow of a near-absolute winner. No one wanted to share too much with a legend, because a legend, in some strange way, made ordinary people feel small and insecure. The media maintained a similar distance. They wrote about him in a tone of respect, analyzing every stride, every achievement, but rarely touched the human being behind it. Carl Lewis was spoken of as a standard, a role model, rather than a person with a complex inner life. And that very cold respect made him more distant than ever. He was admired, but not loved, in the way people love a human being with flaws, everyday stories, moments of weakness. Carl Lewis understood that the public's love for him was tightly bound to the invincible image he represented, and if that image cracked, that affection would vanish just as quickly. That made him even more cautious, more closed off, shrinking his private world to the point where there was only enough room for the bare essentials of existence. With no place to unload, no safe space to let go, Carl learned to carry everything himself, from the pressure of competition to the fear of being misunderstood, from physical fatigue to mental erosion. On long nights after competitions, when the city slept and the cheers had faded far away, he faced a heavy silence, a silence that was not restful, but felt like an endless void. The more he won, the fewer chances he had to connect with others on equal terms, because victory built invisible walls that no one knew how to cross. People did not talk to Carl Lewis like a normal colleague. They were careful. They chose their words. They kept their distance, and that very thing gradually stripped him of the ability to be seen as an ordinary human being. The greatest tragedy of greatness does not lie in having to bear the pressure of performance, but in the way it takes away the ability to naturally share pain. Carl Lewis could not say he was lonely, because how could someone with all the gold medals in the world be allowed to feel lonely? He could not say he needed someone to listen, because an icon was not permitted to need comfort, and so loneliness became an inseparable part of the identity he was forced to carry. Every time he stepped onto the track, thousands cheered him on, but when he turned away, there was no arm waiting, no familiar voice saying everything would be okay. The greater he became, the more Carl Lewis had to accept standing alone, as if that were the default price for the difference he represented. That loneliness did not explode into major tragedy, did not lead to extreme decisions or loud collapses, but quietly wore down his psyche day by day, year by year. It made him more closed, more cautious, less trusting, until even the smallest connections became difficult. Carl Lewis was not betrayed, not abandoned in a dramatic way, but he gradually realized that at the top, the path was only wide enough for one person to stand firm, and that person had to learn on his own how to endure the emptiness that came with it. His tragedy was not that there was no one around him, but that there was no one truly with him, no one who entered his inner world without carrying expectation, comparison, or oppressive admiration. And in that very loneliness, Carl Lewis continued to exist, continued to compete, continued to win, not because he still craved glory, but because that was the only thing he knew how to do to keep the world around him from falling apart. After many years living under the lights, enduring the loneliness of the pinnacle, and carrying on his shoulders the image that an entire nation had placed there, Carl Lewis entered another void, quieter, but no less persistent, 30 years without a home life. In his private life, there were none of the familiar milestones that society usually uses to measure happiness. No marriage, no children, no house echoing with laughter after every return. This was not because Carl Lewis lacked opportunities or was rejected by life, but because the path he chose, with iron discipline and absolute control, had made long-term attachment almost impossible. The relationships that came and went in his life often began with admiration and ended with a growing distance, as the other person realized that to enter Carl Lewis's world, they had to accept standing behind the training schedule, behind the competitions, behind the obsession with performance, and behind a man who always placed duty above emotion. Carl was not heartless. He understood this very well, but he also understood that any distraction from the orbit he had set for himself carried the risk of shaking the entire structure of his life. In his world, control was the only way to survive, and that very control made building a home life something far too fragile. He was not accustomed to sharing living space, not accustomed to letting another person's emotions affect the carefully calculated rhythm of his own life. Personal relationships, no matter how sincere, gradually became an unsolvable equation, because they demanded the flexibility and letting go that he was not allowed to have. Carl Lewis chose his career not because he scorned affection, but because he believed that if he stopped, everything he had built would collapse. The price of that choice did not reveal itself immediately. It did not create loud tragedies, did not appear in the newspapers, did not come with scandals or notoriety. Instead, it existed as a prolonged emptiness, quietly growing over the years. After each competition, when teammates returned to their families, when stories about children, shared dinners, and weekend plans filled the air around him, Carl often just stayed silent because he had nothing similar to share. He lived in one hotel room after another, in endless flights, in temporary spaces that never had time to become home. The absence of scandal helped him maintain his perfect image, but it also meant there was no private story strong enough to anchor him to ordinary life. Each time a season ended, he did not return to a fixed place to rest, but simply shifted from one state of tension to another, with only himself and the same familiar silence. Carl Lewis was not abandoned, but neither was he truly awaited. There was no home waiting to welcome him after the lights went out. 30 years passed like that, and that emptiness gradually became part of his identity, something so familiar that he was no longer sure how he would live if one day he had to face it fully. He had chosen this path very early, and with each passing year, that choice became even more irreversible. No marriage, no children was not a simple lack, but the inevitable consequence of a life designed around perfection and control. Carl Lewis understood that the world honored him for what he achieved on the track, but few asked what he had traded to keep that image from cracking. His career brought him glory and status, but at the same time took away the ability to have a true place to return to. And as the years of competition stretched longer than expected, as age began to leave marks on his body and mind, that emptiness was no longer something he could avoid. It appeared in quiet evenings, in wide rooms with no one to share them, in moments when he realized he had lived fully for a role, but had missed the experience of being an ordinary person. There was no scandal to recount, no loud tragedy to evoke pity, but that very absence was the most persistent pain. Carl Lewis had no place to return to because he had never allowed himself to build one, and the price of that choice was a private life of prolonged emptiness, quiet but enduring, like a reminder that greatness, no matter how celebrated, always demands sacrifices that no medal can compensate for. 30 years of living in iron discipline, in near absolute control, finally led Carl Lewis to the confrontation he could never fully win: time. There was no serious accident that brought him down, no dramatic breaking point that people could easily point to and say everything ended there. The tragedy of Carl Lewis was far more subtle and cruel. It came slowly, quietly, and irreversibly. The body that once responded instantly to every command began to hesitate in the tiniest moments, moments that only someone who had lived his entire life by fractions of a second could notice. The stride was still technically perfect, the breathing still controlled, but something was no longer the same. No one said it out loud, no one publicly admitted it, but Carl Lewis felt very clearly the slowing creeping into every muscle fiber, every start, every takeoff. It was not a sudden collapse, but a silent withdrawal, forcing him to exert more effort each day just to achieve what used to come naturally. The most frightening thing was not the tired body, but the fear of being replaced that began to form in his mind, a fear he had tried to bury for many years. Younger faces appeared more and more, new strides, bodies not yet worn down by thousands of training sessions, hundreds of competitions. Carl Lewis saw his younger self in them, and that feeling was both familiar and painful. He understood that elite sports have no mercy. They wait for no one, acknowledge no past, and care nothing for what a person has sacrificed to stand in the present position. In that world, there is only one question: who is the fastest now? And that question, for the first time in his life, made Carl Lewis feel uneasy. He was not afraid of losing a specific race. He was afraid of the moment he had to accept that he was no longer the absolute standard. That irreversible decline forced him to face what he had avoided his entire life: his own limits. Carl Lewis was not in the habit of complaining about his body, did not allow himself to blame age or circumstances. He continued training with the same level of discipline, even harsher, as if just a little more effort would make time yield. But time does not negotiate. It only quietly advances, leaving small but undeniable signs. Mornings waking up with the feeling that the body no longer responded as quickly as before. Training sessions, needing more recovery time, competitions where he had to mentally prepare for the possibility of no longer standing at the very top. For someone who had lived his whole life through winning, those changes were not just physical issues. They were direct blows to his identity. Carl Lewis was not just a fast athlete, he was the fastest. When that title began to waver, the entire life structure he had built shook with it. That fear could not be shared with anyone, because he had no place to unload, no family to lean on, no safe space to admit that he was aging. The public did not want to see Carl Lewis slowing down. They wanted to see the legend remain undefeated. Colleagues, the younger ones, looked at him with respect mixed with anticipation, waiting for the handover that sports always cruelly impose. The media, while still respecting him, began asking different questions. Questions about how much longer he would compete, whether he should retire while still in glory. For Carl Lewis, those questions were not simply career predictions. They were reminders that time was catching up to him, despite all his efforts at control. He was accustomed to mastering everything in his life, from emotions to image, from training schedule to the smallest details. But with time, he had no control, and that unsettled him more than any opponent he had ever faced. No longer being the fastest did not just mean losing competitive edge. It also meant having to learn to exist in a different role, a role Carl Lewis had never been prepared for. He had spent his entire youth and most of his adult life becoming the perfect image of victory, representing greatness that did not diminish. When the body began to betray him, he was forced to ask himself who he was if he was no longer the one at the top. That question had no clear answer, and that very ambiguity terrified him. Carl Lewis continued competing not because he did not recognize the change, but because he was not ready to face the void that would appear when he stopped. Each race now was not just an effort to win, but also a way to delay the truth that time cannot be defeated. The tragedy of this phase did not lie in Carl Lewis losing races, but in having to watch his own greatness gradually become memory. He was not forced to retire by injury, not pushed out of the spotlight by a disastrous defeat. but had to live with a prolonged process of decline, slow enough to hurt, clear enough to be undeniable. The body did not betray him with violent rebellion, but with cold silence, forcing him to accept a little more of the truth each day that he had never wanted to face. And in that irreversible slowing, Carl Lewis stood before the greatest fear of his life, that one day he would step onto the track, look around, and realize he was no longer the man the whole world once believed was invincible. When Carl Lewis finally stepped away from the track, the moment that outsiders called retirement did not happen as a grand event, but more like a door closing very softly. There was no prolonged applause, no farewell ceremony enough to cover the emptiness waiting just beyond. After many years living in a packed training schedule, in one flight after another, in the rhythm of endless competing and preparing, Carl Lewis suddenly faced something he had never truly had his whole life: time. But that time did not bring peace. It opened a cold silence, where he realized that when the lights went out, no one was waiting at the end of the road. No family to return to, no home where familiar voices welcomed him after every long journey, no clear role to replace the title of athlete that he had carried for nearly his entire life. Carl Lewis did not enter retirement with the mindset of someone prepared for a new life. He entered it like a man whose final pillar of identity had been pulled away. For many years, he had been defined by achievements, by speed, by consecutive victories. When it all stopped, the question, "Who am I now?" appeared without an answer, echoing in the silence of the room he returned to each night. No more countdown clock before competition time, no more call to the field, no more legitimate reason to force body and mind to operate at maximum. And that very absence made Carl Lewis realize a bitter truth. He had spent his whole life preparing to win, but had never been prepared to stop. In the world of elite sports, retirement is often romanticized as a gentle handover, a necessary step back to rest and enjoy the fruits. But for Carl Lewis, it was a silent fall. He had no children to keep him busy, no family responsibilities to force him to quickly find a new rhythm in life. The relationships that had existed around him were mostly tied to his career, to the track, to the legendary role he represented. When that role disappeared, those connections faded too, not out of malice, but because they no longer had a reason to exist. Carl Lewis entered a phase where every day was frighteningly similar, with no climaxes, no clear goals, only long hours with his own thoughts. He had been used to controlling everything, but now what he had to face was uncertainty, a state that discipline could not solve, and where victory was no longer the answer. No one taught Carl Lewis how to live after no longer being a legend. He was respected for what he had achieved, but that respect did not come with a concrete presence in everyday life. He was not forgotten immediately, but neither was he needed in the way he once was. Invitations, interviews, honorary events appeared occasionally, but they were only brief moments, not enough to fill the long void behind them. When he returned to the quietest room of his life, Carl Lewis faced the truth that he had lived too long in a single role to know how to exist outside it. He had no emotional place to return to, because his entire life had been built around moving forward, not around stopping and staying still. That silence was not healing. It was like a cruel test, forcing him to confront everything he had avoided for many years: the loneliness, the emptiness, and the question of self-worth, when no one was cheering anymore. The post-legend tragedy of Carl Lewis did not lie in losing fame or being forgotten, but in having to learn to live without the familiar frame of reference. No more track to define how fast he was, no more opponents to know where he stood, no more schedule to cover the feeling of emptiness. He was forced to sit with himself, in a room where everything was too quiet to escape. Thoughts about the years gone by, about the silent sacrifices, about the things he never had the chance to experience, surfaced one by one, not loudly, but persistently. Carl Lewis realized that the lights that had once illuminated his path had also hidden the shadows he could no longer avoid. And in that room, there was no one waiting to say that everything would be okay, because this was a journey he had to continue alone. No medals, no applause, only memories and unanswered questions about how to exist when the legend had closed. After a long period facing the quietest room of his life, Carl Lewis did not collapse in the way many people imagine legends do after retirement. He did not plunge into self-destructive behavior, did not seek out noise to fill the void, and did not try to stage a fake comeback to cling to the spotlight. Instead, Carl Lewis moved very slowly, cautiously, like someone who had spent his whole life running, but now had to relearn how to walk. He accepted coaching roles, participated in teaching, stood beside the track as someone passing on experience, a living witness to track and field history. From the outside, it looked like a healthy transition, a logical path for a great former athlete. But inside, Carl Lewis soon realized that those new roles could not fill the void left by his career. Teaching others to run fast did not give him the sense of existence he felt when he himself stood at the starting line. Passing on technique, sharing strategies, recounting old stories did not make him feel more alive, because they were all activities tied to the past, not a new future to hold on to. Carl Lewis did not find new joy in the ordinary sense, no replacement passion strong enough to make him wake up each morning with excitement. He carried out those tasks with the familiar professionalism, with the discipline that never left him. But deep down, he knew he was only learning how to exist, not rediscovering happiness. The emptiness did not disappear when he was busy. It was only temporarily covered, then returned in the quietest moments. Evenings after teaching hours, when there were no longer students or athletes around, Carl Lewis faced the same silence he had carried since leaving the track. With no one left to coach, no schedule to follow, no specific goal to conquer, he was forced to stay with himself longer than ever before. And in that silence, he realized something hard to accept. Throughout his whole life, he had used movement to avoid emotions, used speed so he did not have to stop and think, used victory to cover voids he did not know how to name. When it all stopped, no magical healing appeared, no brilliant moment of awakening to say everything would be okay. Carl Lewis did not find complete peace, nor did he find simple joy as many expected. Instead, he learned to endure the silence, learned to let days pass without needing to attach grand meaning to them. It was a slow process, sometimes cruel, because he no longer had the ability to run from himself. He had to accept that there were losses that could not be compensated, choices that could not be reversed, and voids that would remain forever. Carl Lewis did not deceive himself that coaching or teaching could replace the feeling of competing, nor did he try to turn the past into his only source of comfort. He simply existed, one day at a time, with the patience he had honed throughout his career, but this time not to defeat anyone else, but to keep from being swallowed by the emptiness itself. In the eyes of outsiders, Carl Lewis remained a respected icon, a teacher, a living legend. But in his own private world, he knew he had never truly been healed. He had simply learned to carry the cracks without letting them destroy the rest of who he was. Learning to live slowly did not bring joy, but it brought acceptance. Enduring the silence did not erase the pain, but it helped him understand that not every great life has a gentle ending. And in that emptiness, Carl Lewis continued to exist not brilliantly, not victoriously, but also not fallen like someone who had run far enough to understand that some journeys cannot be measured by speed, but can only be lived through, slowly and alone. When the noisy years have faded far away and silence has become the background rhythm of everyday life, the legacy of Carl Lewis begins to be viewed in a different way, slower, deeper, and also harsher. No longer shielded solely by towering record boards, people are forced to ask about the price he paid to keep those numbers enduring for decades. Carl Lewis gradually emerges not just as a winner, but as a symbol of brutal discipline, the kind of discipline that pushed a human being to the absolute limit of capability, while at the same time suffocating the softest parts of spiritual life. In American sports history, few have maintained such stability and standards to a level almost inhuman like he did. That greatness did not come from one explosive moment, but from decades of unrelenting self-control, where every personal choice was placed under the lens of duty and responsibility. But when the spotlight recedes, people realize that it was precisely that discipline which made Carl Lewis different in a painful way. He was great, but not happy in the sense society usually imagines for success. The legacy of Carl Lewis is not the story of a man redeemed by glory, but the story of a human who traded his entire life for perfection. He did not live to seek joy, but to meet what was expected of an icon. In that process, he became the measuring stick for what a proper athlete should be: clean, disciplined, unyielding, flawless. But that measuring stick was also a rigid mold that did not allow him to live fully as an ordinary human, with contradictions, mistakes, and the need to be loved. Carl Lewis became the standard others followed, but had no chance to follow anyone in building a balanced life. His career is recounted through medals, records, and symbolic victories, while the inner life is marked by endurance, loneliness, and unmeasurable sacrifices. Honoring him in the old way, only through achievements, unintentionally overlooks most of the story, that to keep that standard from collapsing, he had to accept a life lacking the things that make up simple happiness. As society begins to reevaluate its legends, Carl Lewis appears as an uncomfortable but necessary reminder. He proves that greatness does not automatically bring fulfillment, and that a life perfect on paper can hide deep inner voids. People praise him for not falling in the doping era, for maintaining honor in a time full of skepticism, but few stop to ask the mental price of always having to be right, always clean, always perfect. Carl Lewis paid that price with prolonged isolation, with never allowing himself to live out of rhythm even once. He became the symbol of discipline to a cruel degree, where every personal emotion was placed behind duty, where every private desire was postponed indefinitely. In that legacy, there is no tragic collapse for people to pity, nor a fulfilling ending for people to feel reassured. There is only a man who lived true to the role history assigned him, but had to sacrifice most of what makes life warm. Honoring Carl Lewis in tragedy does not mean denying his greatness, but looking straight at the truth that that greatness was built on very fragile foundations. He was not a hero in the romantic sense, nor a victim of fate. He was someone who actively chose the harshest path and went all the way, even knowing that path did not lead to happiness. A whole life traded for perfection. Carl Lewis leaves to future generations not only lessons about winning, but also hard-to-answer questions about the limits of sacrifice. How much is enough to be called great, and how much is too much to the point of losing oneself? His legacy, therefore, does not lie in being idolized or pitied, but in forcing us to reflect again on how society defines success. Carl Lewis shows that there are people born to bear heavier roles than the rest, to keep a standard alive, even if the price is a life lacking joy. And in that quiet tragedy, his legacy becomes deeper than any record board, proof that greatness, when built on brutal discipline, can endure very long in history, but does not always leave peace for the very person who created it. When time has passed far enough to soften the harsh demands, America begins to look back at Carl Lewis with a different gaze, slower and less judgmental. The media, once accustomed to placing him in the position of an inviolable standard, now starts rewriting the story in a more subdued tone. No longer headlines demanding that he represent moral perfection, no longer probing questions about whether he was worthy or not. Instead, there are articles reevaluating the context, reevaluating the pressure of an era that forced one man to carry too much meaning on his shoulders. America finally understands that Carl Lewis was not just an athlete, but a product of collective expectations, of the need to find a clean image to cling to amid years full of doubt and cheating. That understanding comes late, when he is no longer on the track, when the body has slowed down, when private life has passed in prolonged silence. But even if belated, it still holds special meaning, because for the first time, Carl Lewis is seen as a complete human being, rather than just an icon frozen in a frame. In the new analyses, people begin to acknowledge that expecting one individual to be perfect for 3 decades is unreasonable. Articles and public conversations gradually shift from the question, "What did he do to be great?" to the question, "What did he have to sacrifice to maintain that greatness?" Carl Lewis is no longer scrutinized for every tiny detail, as Cronson time, if any deviation were a betrayal. He is no longer forced to explain every silence, no longer required to prove he deserves public trust. But that relief does not come at the right time. It appears when he has already grown accustomed to living in quiet rooms, when he has learned to endure emptiness without expecting anyone to understand. America's understanding, therefore, carries the tone of an unspoken apology, a realization that society once demanded too much from one person, then walked away when that person could no longer meet the ideal image. Carl Lewis receives that change not with bursting joy, but with a calm that is almost weary. He no longer needs vindication, nor does he need to be re-honored in a new way. The years lived in discipline and loneliness have made him understand that recognition, whether early or late, cannot return what has been lost. But no longer being required to be perfect brings him something else, small but important: the right to exist without having to represent anything greater than himself. The media, in its belated role, begins retelling Carl Lewis's story as a human journey, where achievements and pain go side by side, where greatness does not obscure fragility. Those articles do not make him younger, do not fill the long-formed voids, but at least they ask the right questions that society should have asked much earlier. America finally understands that building perfect icons can provide temporary comfort, but the price is often shifted entirely onto the individual's shoulders. Carl Lewis lived his whole life to fulfill an image, and when that image was no longer needed as before, he was left with the consequences that no one else had to bear. That belated understanding is therefore not just his story alone, but a broader lesson about how a society treats those it exalts. Carl Lewis is no longer required to be perfect, but he also cannot turn back time to live differently. The only thing left is a more honest recognition of what happened, and the acceptance that there are people who sacrificed their entire lives for a standard they did not create themselves. In that new gaze, Carl Lewis is no longer the cold measuring stick of discipline and victory, but a human being who endured for a very long time to keep an ideal alive. Understanding that arrives when everything is over is not redemption, but it opens a space for his story to be retold more accurately. And perhaps that is the most important thing America has finally learned, that behind every inviolable legend there is always a human who paid the price, and understanding, even if late, is still necessary so that history does not repeat the same mistake with the icons that follow. When the debates have died down and the media lights no longer illuminate every step, Carl Lewis enters the final phase of his life's journey in a way very different from what people once imagined for a legend. No more track, no more starting gun, tearing through the air, no more thousandths of a second, haunting every breath. The Carl Lewis of today lives slowly in a way that throughout his entire youth he was never allowed to experience for himself. Mornings no longer begin with a harsh training schedule, but with the quiet of a body that has gone through too many years of discipline. He no longer has to prove anything to anyone, no longer has to represent a standard, no longer has to maintain the image of the moral winner in a world always ready to judge. Peace comes to him not noisily, not with the feeling of victory or redemption, but like a natural settling after a storm that lasted decades. Carl Lewis no longer runs, no longer tries to surpass anyone else, and no longer surpasses himself in the harshest sense. He lives in the slow rhythm of old age, where each day passes without needing to be tied to a specific goal or achievement. The steps he takes now are not measured by speed, but by the fullness of each quiet moment. He reads books, thinks, sometimes returns to old memories, not to reminisce about glory, but to understand that everything that happened is inseparable from the person he is today. This peace is not a reward, but a state that arrives when all the races have ended, when there is nothing left to compete for or defend. It carries within it a light sadness, because Carl Lewis understands very well that this peace cannot erase the years that were lost, cannot return the ordinary experiences he never had the chance to live. There are afternoons that pass very slowly, when Carl Lewis sits alone, listening to the silence he once feared. Now, that silence is no longer an enemy, but the only companion left. He does not try to fill it with activity or words, does not seek to turn it into grand meaning. He simply lets it exist, as an inevitable part of life after glory. Peace that comes late does not bring complete comfort, because it always goes hand in hand with the awareness that some things that have passed cannot be reclaimed. Carl Lewis does not deceive himself that, if he could choose again, everything would be different. He understands that the path he took, with all its pain and sacrifice, was the only one that could lead to the legend the world once revered. In that slow rhythm of life, Carl Lewis does not seek forgiveness from the past, nor does he hope to be pitied. He simply exists, simply and quietly, like a man who has run far enough to know that not every life needs a perfect ending. Peace does not come to redeem him, but to give him one final quiet space, where he can live without a role to play, without a title, without victory, and it is precisely that imperfect peace that fully reflects Carl Lewis's life. A life built on speed, discipline, and pressure, ending in slowness and silence, where the lost years still linger, like long shadows, but no longer weigh down each step as heavily as before. At the end point of that long journey, when there is no more track to step forward on, and nothing left to prove, Carl Lewis stands still like a man who has lived fully with his choices, even though those choices never led to complete happiness. His life has no moment of redemption, no emotional turnaround to transform all the pain into a sweet reward. Carl Lewis does not find a fulfilling family at the end of the road, does not find simple joy big enough to cover the years that were lost. But he also does not betray himself, does not deny the person who stepped onto the track with the belief that discipline and devotion were the only path he knew. The double life he carried for 30 years was not deception, but the price to pay for existing in the role that history and society had assigned. A public life built on a perfect image, and a private life shrunk to the point where there was only enough room for endurance. Carl Lewis did not live two lives to fool the world, but to protect the world from the truth that even the greatest icons can be fragile. The tragic conclusion of Carl Lewis does not lie in collapse, but in steadfastness to the very end. He does not step out of the legendary role through rebellion or rejection of the past, but through a cold acceptance that some paths, once chosen, have no turns leading to ordinary happiness. Carl Lewis understood that very early, even if he may never have dared to name it. He knew that to become the standard, he had to sacrifice the right to err, the right to be weak, and ultimately, the right to live an ordinary life. But what makes him different is not that endurance, but the fact that he did not let the endurance turn him into a bitter or rebellious person. He continued to live true to the principles that had kept him standing for decades, even when those principles no longer brought joy. In Carl Lewis's world, Betraying oneself was worse than failure, and therefore he chose to remain fully true to who he was, even if the price was a life lacking the warmth that others consider happiness. Looking back, the double life of Carl Lewis emerges as a symbol of the price of greatness in a society that always needs perfect images to believe in. He shouldered the heavy part that his era did not want to face: the fear of cheating, the obsession with morality, and the longing for a flawless hero. To meet those demands, he isolated himself from ordinary life, turned himself into a model not allowed to crack. And when that era passed, when those demands were no longer as harsh as before, Carl Lewis was still there, carrying the consequences of an irreversible choice. He does not demand pity, nor does he need to be praised again. His story exists as a quiet reminder that behind every legend is a human who paid a very real price. The final message for the mature American audience is not a call for admiration or regret, but a sober acknowledgement. Not every legend is born to be happy. Some are born to bear the heavy part for an entire era, to keep the values society needs to believe in from collapsing. Carl Lewis is one of those. He does not find complete happiness, has no gentle ending in the ordinary sense, but he lived true to the person he chose to become. And in that quiet steadfastness, Carl Lewis's legacy goes beyond medals and records, becoming a story about the price of greatness, a price not glamorous, not fully repaid, but still deserving of the deepest respect. Looking back at the entire story of Carl Lewis, the lingering emotion is not the overwhelming awe of medals or records, but a quiet sadness for a man who lived his whole life under the pressure to be perfect. The tragedy of Carl Lewis does not come from poverty, scandal, or public collapse, but from very specific and persistent things: a childhood disciplined to the point of losing the right to weakness, a talent that won too early so that each victory became a burden, the 1984 Olympics, turning him into a moral icon that America did not allow to err, and 30 years living in a double life, where the real person had to shrink to protect the public image. He has no family to return to, no children to extend his private life, no place called home when the lights go out, and even in retirement, he only faces a quiet room. No role, no emotional escape. The story reveals a painful truth. Carl Lewis did everything society demanded correctly, but the price was a prolonged inner emptiness, where peace only arrives very late and without redemption. Yet what makes him worthy of honor does not lie in happiness, but in steadfastness. He does not betray himself, does not break the standard for an easy escape, does not use scandal or rebellion to demand attention back. The lesson for Americans today is a mature and necessary one. Do not turn people into icons and then demand they bear all the fears of the era. Success should not be measured only by discipline and victory, but also by the ability to live fully, to err, to be tired, and to be human. Carl Lewis reminds us that greatness can hold up an era, but if society does not know when to stop, the very legends we worship will be the ones who pay the most. If the story of Carl Lewis makes you reflect on the silent price of greatness and the sacrifices legends have to bear, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like to join us. Thank you for listening to the very end, and see you in the next video, where we continue exploring the real stories behind America's glory.